Good evening, and thank you for joining us for another class in our Teaching as Jesus Taught, which is, is obviously turning out to be a virtual online class. Not what I was expecting, and certainly not what I was hoping for. But we're doing the best that we can, reaching out in the very best way that we can, and presenting this for you. I hope that you've been following along in your book, giving it some consideration. There's just 3 or 4 or 5 questions in any one of the lessons just to give it some thought ahead of time so that when you come into the class, when you sit down and you listen, you're able to follow along, participate a little bit better in that sense in your own mind, because this is definitely more of a challenge when we're doing it this way. It is for me as a teacher. I'm sure it is for you as well. If you have a question or something that comes up from the class, I'd be happy for you to post me the question or text me, send it to me, and I'll try to answer it when we get back together in the next class. But it is what it is, and like I said, didn't want it this way, but I really am thankful that we at least have this medium. And for those of you who are tuning in and are watching, following along, it gives you something to consider, some spiritual nourishment during the week that you can benefit from in that way. So we're going to be on lesson number 11 this evening. Lesson number 11 on how did Jesus use word pictures when he was teaching. And we'll start out with a word of prayer and then we'll get going. Our Father, thank you for letting us meet together, at least in this fashion. And thank you for the benefit and blessing of your word. And thank you for the perfect example of Jesus who teaches us how to teach. Lord, we sometimes just ignore that, and we sometimes blindly go at it our own way. Help us to learn from looking at him. And as we examine this tonight about different word pictures that Jesus used, an area we don't often think about, but that Jesus used considerably in his teaching. Help us to be more aware of that and see if we can't do a better job as we reach out to teach those who are lost as well as to teach and encourage the saved. Please be with those who are struggling right now. We know, at least in this congregation, we've had folks who've lost loved ones very recently, some who have loved ones who are sick and facing different challenges and going through treatments, and just asking you to be with them, comfort their hearts, and give them peace as they go through these challenging times. Bless our study tonight and open our eyes to see the wonderful things you have in store for us in your word. We pray this in Jesus' name, and amen. All right, so the last 2 weeks we've talked about questions, and we looked at how Jesus used questions in his teaching to promote the people to think or to respond, and sometimes even to pull them up short by asking a question. And then we looked at the questions that people asked of Jesus and how he dealt with those, how he responded to their questions. And of course, those lessons, along with all of these this quarter, are designed to help us better be teachers like Jesus was, and to try to do the kind of things he would want us to do. So we're going to move into this on word pictures tonight. And a friend of mine used to say to me on a regular basis that he was raised so poor he couldn't pay attention. Now, I know that wasn't original with him, but he was the first person that I heard say it, and I can remember at the time thinking, okay, wow, that's really poor. Somebody to be so poor they can't even pay attention. But the idea behind that, it's a word picture, and it gives us a frame of reference that's just out of the ordinary, rather than just say, I was raised and we didn't have anything, or I was just raised really poor. And a vivid word picture has an ability to stick with you and stay with you, maybe for months, maybe for years, that you've read something in a book, you've read a poem, there's a line in that, or maybe even watched a movie or some TV show, or heard a comedian, and there's a line, a word picture that they gave you that just has stuck with you, so much better than just using flat, ordinary, unintentional words that convey thoughts as well. So this being so poor you can't pay attention is obviously a pun. And a pun is a word picture, a kind of word picture. We're not going to use that specifically tonight, although Jesus, I think, used a couple of puns when he taught. But we're going to look at some other ones and talk about word pictures in that regard as you look at your lesson. Someone once wrote this and said, "The pain felt like the stab of a dagger of frozen ice from a poisoned well." Okay, that's a very vivid picture painted with words. An ice dagger, not a knife, not a gun, not a sword. This is a dagger, a shard of ice, and the pain, it was like the stab from that, and not just a shard of ice, but this shard of ice came from a poisoned well. I mean, that's a very vivid word picture in our mind. And it says so much more picturesque than to say, it hurt, or it hurt really bad. But the stab, the pain from this was just like an ice dagger and from a poisoned well. It just has this vivid way to stand out. And so that's what a word picture does. As I've got there in your notes, word pictures are powerful. And they do four things. The first of all, they pique the curiosity or the interest of the hearer. So when you hear a statement that says, "I was raised so poor, I couldn't pay attention," all of a sudden you're shocked a little bit. There's a shock to the sensibilities that says, "Oh, I need to listen up." And it piques our curiosity that we're quite interested now to hear that, or our interest. The second one is it prods the hearer's thinking. When you hear a word picture that's used in a certain way, oftentimes the response is, I have to stop a moment and think about it. And that's why you use a word picture, to get people to rather than just have the words go in one ear and out the other, that they hear sounds and it's bouncing off and it's vibrations in their eardrum. But these are words that now sink into them, and it makes them stop and think, and it prods their hearer, their thinking in that regard, that it makes them think of the next thought. What's the next thought? What does this mean, and why would he say it this way? The third reason is to prompt the hearer's reflection. And so you hear somebody say something, or you read something, and your response to that might be, "Well, I didn't have it like that," or "I wonder what that means for me," or "How would I deal with this situation?" That it's personal reflection now that has been prompted by that. And in the fourth way, and I think this is one of the great things about it, is that word pictures prompt retention. In that we hear something, instead of just flat words, "It hurt," it hurt real bad, to say that the pain was like the stab of a dagger of ice from a poisoned well. That will stick with us more so than to say, it hurt really bad. And so this retention stays around. And that I believe is one of the main reasons that Jesus used word pictures, is for retention. They didn't have a lot of the ability to, as we do now, just to tap your phone and you're recording what the person said, whether audibly or video recording somebody. So if you were there, if Jesus were here in our day, and Jesus was saying some things that you thought were profound, it would just be so easy for you to pull out your phone and just record what they're saying. But Jesus said things in a memorable, picturesque way so that people would really hang on and think about it. So many of the word pictures that Jesus used are so powerful that they cross over. And they're not just used biblically. They're not just used by people who are very familiar with the Bible. In fact, I would suggest to you, as I've got in your notes, that there are a number of word pictures that Jesus uses that people use today that have no familiarity with the Bible. A Good Samaritan, being a Good Samaritan. There are a lot of people that wouldn't know that came from a Bible story that Jesus told. They just understand that means to be nice to somebody, to do good for somebody, maybe even somebody you don't know, just to show kindness to them. And they would use that phrase. Or maybe it is they've heard the phrase before, and you can't serve two masters. Well, that's a biblical phrase as well that has its roots or its beginnings in Jesus. Don't throw your pearls before swine. People who don't know anything about the Bible would use that same reference today to say, don't waste your time. Don't waste your efforts. Don't waste your time. It's just not going to do you any good at all. They wouldn't be aware necessarily that comes from Jesus or from the Bible, but they would do it. Or the blind leading the blind, and we hear that phrase. And a lot of other things. And so my point of saying that is, that's why Jesus used word pictures, I'm persuaded, because it has such retention. We remember these things. We think about that. We understand what those phrases mean or what those words mean, and they're powerful in that regard. And words by themselves can be uninteresting, can be flat, and can just be words on a page, printed letters that make up words, that make up sentences, that make up paragraphs, and we can get lost in that. We've all done that. We've all read something before and read through it and had no idea what we read, no retention of it, no thought of it. It was just words on a page. And words on a page can be like that. But we tend to think, all of us tend to think in pictures. And sight is such a big part of who we are and how we think. We even dream in pictures. We sometimes dream in words as well. We remember somebody said something or whatever in a dream. But most often it's a picture. This event, that event, something happens. A bear is chasing us. We're driving in the car. Whatever the dream might be of, we tend to dream in pictures. We tend to think in pictures. And so we ought to try to teach or talk in picturesque words as well. And Jesus used word pictures all the time. The first question that I've got here in your book, obviously I can't get a response from you, but what are some word pictures that you can think of that are memorable, that come back to mind for you? Maybe it was a poem that you learned, and a line in a poem that just really stuck with you. Or maybe it was a movie that you watched, and go ahead, make my day, or whatever the case is. That there might be something in a movie, a line, that just sticks with you. And there's a word picture maybe associated with that. Maybe it's a book you've read. Maybe it's a phrase out of the Bible or whatever. But we all have those, and we all think in that way. So let me just look at a few of these tonight. And we'll talk about, first of all, similes. And I don't want you to get all freaked out thinking we're going back to English grammar. But it's interesting and it's good for us to see this and to learn. The first one, a simile, is a comparison of one thing with another thing that is different, using the words like or as. And so a lot of Jesus' parables are similes in the way that he says them. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sows sows seed in the field. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that's put into the lump of dough. The kingdom of heaven is like a net that was used, a drag net to catch fish and so on. So I asked you to consider the simile that's used in Matthew chapter 10 and at verse 16. So let me turn there and read that passage for you. And then I was going to say we'll talk about it. I guess I'll talk about it. Chapter 10 and verse 16. Behold, Jesus said, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So the first part of this question was, how are disciples like sheep? Since Jesus is using this as an example, I send you out as sheep, like sheep, in the midst of wolves, this simile that he uses. Well, we might say that one of the ways that we are like sheep is that we're not all that brilliant sometimes. Sheep are pretty dumb animals, and we can be pretty dumb sometimes. But I think probably more than anything else is he's talking about that the docile creatures that are just sadly they are there for the prey of the wolves. And sometimes we're not aware. Sometimes we wander off like sheep. Sometimes we don't pay enough attention. We wander, we lose our way. And so Jesus says, behold, you're going to go out like or as sheep in the midst of wolves. So who were the wolves? Well, if we were to read the whole context there, which we won't take our time this evening in the class to do this, but the wolves would be the enemies of Christians or the enemies of Christ. And according to the context, this could be the Romans. It could be the Jews. It could be, the Lord points out even later in chapter 10, it could be those even of your own household that are the wolves. So we have to be careful. Jesus said, I'm sending you out into this world like these docile sheep in the midst of these ravenous wolves who are out to get you. You may not have nearly the power to fight them off, you don't think. So I want you to be careful, be aware. And that's why he uses that second phrase, another example by that. So be wise as serpents. Here's another simile. So we should be like serpents in the sense of our cunning and craftiness and wisdom, and as harmless as a dove. And so Jesus is using that simile in that way. So when Jesus used similes, or when any one of us uses a simile, he didn't mean, nor do we mean, that the person or the thing is that they are alike in every single way. It's a generalization. Oftentimes, we have to find it from the context. So what does he mean? If he just said we were sheep and left it at that, we wouldn't have exactly an idea. But in the midst of wolves, oh, okay, we're the docile ones. We don't have nearly that strength and power maybe that they do. But there are similarities. And it's to make a person think, okay, how am I like this? Or how is that as that? And to give consideration to that. And Jesus used it a lot in his teaching. Jesus used things from nature, the sun. He talked about seeds, about wheat, about branches. He talked about people, different groups of people, sowers or farmers, merchants, kings, virgins, others that he talked about. He used a lot of different similes, and he would take a profound spiritual truth and he would make it more understandable by comparing it to something that people could understand and people could see. And I think there's another thing that he does in that he takes a profound spiritual truth and he boils it down into something not only that I can understand, but that I can remember. I don't have to have a theological degree to be able to understand and remember what Jesus is teaching. I'm supposed to be like a dove. I'm supposed to be like a serpent. I'm supposed to be like a sheep. And so I can take that now and think about cunning and craftiness, harmlessness, docile nature, whatever. And I can now take these profound spiritual thoughts, these deep theological principles many times, and understand it with my simple brain in a, oh, okay, I got it. It's a picture of what I'm supposed to be or how I'm supposed to be. I think a good question maybe for us to consider as teachers, I know it's a good question for me to think, are we trying to be profound, or are we trying to be too profound when we teach? Rather than Jesus, who tried to take the profound and make it simple, are we trying to take the simple and make it profound because then I get some kind of honor or glory out of that? Or am I trying to take these deep, profound, theological, spiritual principles and make it easy enough for a child to understand so that God gets the glory and God gets the credit? I think there's a good point there that we as teachers need to give consideration to. Not to try to be profound so that I look good, but to try to make the profound simple so that God looks good and people can see that. So the second word picture that we'll talk about that Jesus used would be a metaphor. A metaphor similar to a simile, as we've got here. It's one thing acts like or represents another thing in which the two things are unlike each other, but different from a simile. A metaphor does not use like or as in the comparison. I gave you a couple of examples in your book from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." Now, if it was a simile, Jesus would have said, "You are like salt. You are as light." But he didn't say that. He makes it a statement. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. In verse 38, the field is the world. John chapter 8 and verse 12, I am the light of the world. Not I am like a light in the world, or I am as the light of the world. I am the light of the world, Jesus says, a metaphor. I am the good shepherd in John chapter 10, Jesus says. So that's a metaphor. And as we said, that a metaphor has great force because it immediately grabs your attention. It's more forceful than a simile. A simile is it's like this, it's as that, okay, so my mind has to, okay, I can see that, I can see. But to just make a statement, a bold declaration, I am the good shepherd, Jesus said. I am the light of the world. Well, that's a little more shocking. It's a little more profound in the sense that it has its force or even a shock effect. Well, what? You are the light of the world? You're not like a light? You are the good shepherd? It has great force behind it. Jesus says this on one occasion, Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15, still in the Sermon on the Mount. Beware of false prophets, he said, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. He didn't say they're like ravenous wolves. He said they are. You know, our response to that is, yikes. False prophets are wolves. And that ought to shock our sensibilities. It ought to make us be very concerned about when we hear somebody teaching something, is this true? Is this the Word of God? If it is not, if they are a false person, a teacher of falsehood, and their life is characterized by this, we ought to beware because Jesus says they have a purpose. They have a goal. That is to take you down. They're a ravenous wolf, and you're just that little docile sheep. So, in your book again, the question, it says, consider John chapter 10, verses 1 to 18. This is a beautiful passage about Jesus being the good shepherd, Jesus being the gate or the door to the sheepfold, and he talks about thieves and robbers, and he talks about the sheep. All of that in this passage that we won't take all the time to read. But in verses 7 and 9, Jesus says, I am the door to the sheep, or I am the door to the sheepfold, or the gate, your translation may say. And so how or what similarities exist between Jesus and a gate in the context of what he's talking about? Well, first of all, I would suggest to you that the gate or the door, like the door in this room here, that it closes off this room from what's outside. And there is a sense of a protection or prevention from keeping the outside from coming in. And there is that sense. But also the door serves on the flip side purpose of that, and that is of allowing admittance. I can open the door and allow what's outside to come into this room. And as the sheepfold is there as the place of safety where the sheep are staying overnight, Jesus being the door or the gate to that, he does those two things. He allows, first of all, keeps predators from coming in and keeps them out. but he also allows the gate or the door to open up and his own to come in. So there's a sense of protection, a sense of interest and admittance in. And it's also interesting to me as I thought about this, as I was putting this together again today and looking at this, it's the point of where everything happens. And Jesus is that. He is the point of where anything comes in or anything is kicked out or kept out. Jesus is the focal point of all of that. There is the door or the gate. The second question of this says, what similarities exist between Jesus and the shepherd, which he mentions in verses 11 and 14, that he's the good shepherd. Well, I think in the context it's very clear that he lovingly cares for his sheep. He provides for them. He goes before them and he leads them. He's intimately aware of his sheep. And on the other side of that, from the sheep standpoint, I said, what similarities exist between Jesus and the shepherd? But also the sheep now know who the shepherd is, know who their shepherd is. And they follow his voice and they follow this shepherd because they know he's the one who cares for them. He's the one who provides the things they need. He's the one who leads them, so he is the one that I'll follow. And so this metaphor is very strong in John chapter 10 as it's given here. The third one, I had to look this word up. I didn't know what this was when I started studying this hypokatasis or katasis. It's similar to a metaphor, but only one item is mentioned. It's not the two, but when Jesus was talking about Herod, he said, go tell that fox, or go tell that old fox in Luke chapter 13 and verse 32. If Jesus would have used a metaphor, he would have said that Herod is a fox. If he would have used a simile, he would have said that Herod is like a fox. But he doesn't. He just says, go tell that fox. Jesus used this form frequently throughout his ministry. May not have recognized it as what this is, but when he called his disciples fishers of men, I'll make you fishers of men, or little children, or reapers in a harvest in Matthew chapter 4, chapter 11, and John 4. He called the Pharisees a brood of vipers. He called the Gentiles dogs in Matthew chapter 12. Jesus even referred to his own body as a temple and his ministry or doing the will of God as being the food that he ate. He used this form in that sense. So in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 to 5, this is again in the Sermon on the Mount. Notice beginning at verse 1, it says, judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back at you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but you do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So I asked the question in your book here, what does Jesus call a minor offense? And from the context here, he talks about it being a speck or a mote in some translations, or a little speck of sawdust. And what does he call a major offense? He said it's a plank, it's a beam. And so this is one of the classic occasions of a word picture that Jesus uses of somebody who has a little tiny speck in his eye, a little speck of dust that's flown into his eye. And he's trying to get it out, and another fellow walks up to him with a 4x4 beam sticking out of his eye and says, here, let me help you get that. Let me help you clean that out. And Jesus said, that's such hypocrisy. He said, what you need to do is take the beam out of your eye, take the plank out of your eye before you can go try to help somebody get a little teeny tiny speck of dust out of their eye. He said it's hypocrisy. And his point of it is, in the first couple of verses, don't judge others unfairly. Whatever standard of judgment we use with others, Jesus said will be used right back on us. All right, the next one is personification. And this is an easy one to remember because it makes it like a person. Personification is when an object is given human-like characteristics or traits. Jesus used this word picture as well. He said on one occasion, you may remember this, that he told that people came up and complained and said, Jesus, you need to tell your followers to be quiet. And Jesus said, I tell you that if these should be silent, the stones, that is these rocks on the ground, would immediately begin to cry out. You see, he makes it sound as if rocks have mouths and vocal cords and minds to be able to think and to speak and to utter words of praise. It's a vivid word picture that Jesus uses on this occasion. Or when he implied that the mountains have ears in Luke chapter 23, he says, then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. When this great devastation comes, he makes it sound as if the mountains and the hills have ears, and they can listen, and they can follow along. So this method, as I've got here, as with the other ones, piques the curiosity of the listener and makes them more aware of what is being said, and it tends to be more memorable. The last one we'll talk about tonight is hyperbole. Or as the comedian said, this is the epitome of hyperbole. The hyperbole is an intentional exaggeration that is not designed to be taken literally, but the exaggeration is designed to make a point, to emphasize how strong, how big, or whatever this point is. It creates a shock value, again, when this is said. They're not to be taken literally. It's to be designed to create that effect. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this, and sadly, some have actually taken these words of Jesus literally, and as I've got, but listen, Matthew chapter 5, verse 29. Jesus said, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than that your whole body would be cast into hell. Now, Jesus didn't mean this literally. He didn't mean that if we were in a store and we looked around and nobody was watching and we pick up something and we stole it, we put it in our pockets, we hid it, and we walked out of the store with that when we were confronted with our own guilt, when we recognized our own sinfulness to God, that if my right hand caused me to sin, that I should in some way whack my hand off and so I'll never steal again. Well, I could steal with my left hand. And he doesn't say anything about the left hand. If I chopped off both hands, I could pick it up with my elbows. He's not talking about literally chopping off your hand or literally ripping your eye out of your socket. The point of that is that wouldn't cure the problem. The problem is a heart issue, that my mind or my heart is not right with God. If I'm stealing, if I'm looking at things and sinning with my eyes, I've got a heart issue. Sin is always a heart issue. His point of saying it in this way is to exaggerate just how severe that kind of situation would be, to whack off your hand or rip out your eye, to say that's how bad sin is. That we ought to have an immediate effect that I want to take care of this right now. This is severe. This is big. This is something I just can't let go on. I must respond and take quick action to take care of this sin. So I asked the question from Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 24. I asked, what is the hyperbole that's being used, and what is the point of this? Verse 23 says, Then Jesus said to his disciples, Assuredly I say unto you that it is hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again I say, verse 24, to you, that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. All right, so what's the hyperbole? Well, the hyperbole is the exaggeration of just trying to cram a camel through the eye of this needle. Taking this camel and trying to force it through the eye of that needle. That's hyperbole. That's an exaggeration that's not going to happen. Can you imagine the effort it would take to try and even get the hair of the camel through the eye of the needle? And so he says, I'm telling you, it's hard for a rich man to get to heaven. Because if you're a rich man, it's so easy to trust in your riches rather than to trust in God. And what he's saying is here that riches and wealth, that's not the be-all that ends all, that's for sure. In fact, spiritually speaking, you need to be careful. You need to be concerned. Not saying you can't be a rich man and be a Christian, and a rich man and be a faithful Christian. But what he's saying is, it's going to be very difficult to continue to trust in God rather than to trust in your riches. All right, so those are some examples of word pictures that Jesus used. I gave you some to do on your own at the end. I'm hesitant to give you the answers because if you didn't do them, then you just fill in the answer. But let me go through these and see. I hope you, if you haven't done it, let me encourage you to do this. If you haven't done these next few, where I just read cite the passage, I want you to stop the video right now and go through, put down what you think is the answer, what word picture is using, and then when you're done, which there's only about 8, 10 of these, then turn it back on and we'll give the answer. So let me give you time to pause this video at this moment. If you already did it, you want to follow along, here's what we got. First one is from Matthew chapter 11. It should be verse 17, not 7. I had a typo there, at least in my book. It says, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? So what'd you put down? Well, this is a hypocatesis that Jesus uses here. How about the second one? I am the bread of life. That was a little bit more straightforward. It's a metaphor. Okay? The third one from Matthew chapter 23 and verse 24. Blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Very similar to what we just mentioned. That's hyperbole. That's an exaggeration, trying to swallow a camel. He says. The next one from Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, or huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. What'd you put on that one? It's a simile. It's a little bit easier to find in that the first word is as. Usually we see them, Jonah is as this, but as Jonah was 3 days, so that's a simile. The next one from John chapter 3 and verse 8. The wind blows wherever it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. John chapter 3 and verse 8. What is that? That's personification. It's assigning human-like characteristics to wind. See, the wind, it makes it sound like the wind has a will, a mind, and it can decide which way to blow, east, west, north, south, whatever. And then we hear the sound of it. It's personification. The next one, from Luke chapter 10 and verse 18. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That should be an easy one for you. It's a simile. I saw Satan fall like lightning. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 22, I tell you, I do not say unto you up to 7 times, when Peter asked him how many times to forgive. Jesus said, but up to 70 times 7. That's hyperbole. Jesus wasn't saying count out 490 times. He's using a huge number. We should be forgiving people is what Christians should be. And the last one, feed my lambs or tend my sheep. This one, again, like we started out with, is a hypocatastasis because he only mentions one thing, one item out of this. So, as you're reading through the Gospels, as you're reading through the Bible, just see if these kind of things don't jump out at you now a little bit more and see what Jesus is doing. As you're reading through the book of Proverbs, you'll see some of that. In fact, there's a lot of it. The fool is like this, obviously a simile and so on. So thank you for joining us this evening for this class. And we'll be right back here again online, Facebook and YouTube. And we'll have the next lesson in this. What is it? Going to be lesson number 12, I think. And that we will move on to. We're almost done with this quarter. Lesson number 12 next week. We will talk about some more similar to word pictures and how Jesus used rhetorical devices. And then we will finish up the last week and talk about stories. So thanks for joining us, and hope you'll join us next week.